one of the most important powers the Founding Fathers gave the presidency was to be commander-in-chief. This was again a checks and balancing act between Congress. So they gave the president the power to be commander-in-chief, but they also gave Congress the power to declare war, to balance the powers, the president's power over as head of the military, as commander-in-chief. However, despite the fact that Congress is the one who declares war, presidents have used military force over 125 times since the founding without prior congressional approval. This all came to a head in the fiasco that was Vietnam. After Vietnam, or even during Vietnam, Congress attempted to reassert some of its war-making powers by passing the War Powers Act in 1973, coincidentally over a presidential veto. Nixon vetoed it. He was commander-in-chief, he was president at the time, felt that this was a constitutional violation of his power of commander-in-chief, and in fact, as you'll see in the next slide, no president has acknowledged the constitutionality of the War Powers Act. But we'll come back to that in a second. So Congress, because of Vietnam, said we've got to do something to regain our war-making powers and not just let the president take our military wherever he or she wants it to go and then get us embroiled in a war without our approval. And so they passed this War Powers Act. So what did the War Powers Act require? It required four basic ideas, four basic things that the president had to do if he were to introduce the troops in the war. First, the president must report in writing to Congress within 48 hours of introducing troops into a hostile situation. Seems simple enough, right? But the problem with the provision of the War Powers Act was, if the president has already introduced troops into this hostile situation, he's already committed us. So there's a weakness in the War Powers Act there. Second provision, within 60 days, Congress, assuming the president has introduced troops, then Congress within 60 days must declare war or give statutory authorization for a continuation of hostilities. And if they don't do that, point number 3, if Congress fails to do that, the president must remove troops. This is what's called a legislative veto, where Congress doesn't have to do anything and then something happens. A legislative veto was declared unconstitutional. So within this provision of the War Powers Act, there's an issue in and of itself right there. And finally, let's say that Congress does in fact give congressional authorization, either by congressional authorization or declaring war. If at any time they pass a concurrent resolution, and concurrent resolutions president may not veto, then the president must remove the troops. So that's Congress's attempt to regain their war-making powers. Ultimately, a feeble attempt. Congress has a power that they could use if they just had the will to do it, that they wouldn't even need this War Powers resolution. The problem is they haven't had the will to use it. And that power is this. Congress could control what the president does simply by cutting off funds to fight these hostilities, which Congress never does. And so that is the biggest weakness that Congress has over the war powers of the president. They just are afraid to use the stick that they have to bend the president, at least to some of their will, because they don't want to leave the troops stranded wherever they're at. And we've already mentioned this point, that no president has ever acknowledged the constitutionality of the War Powers Act. So there it is, Congress in a nutshell. We are going to do one more video relative to some modern issues with respect to war. But before we go there, let me just read you one concept about the executive power of the presidency. The executive power, Constitution states, shall be vested in the President of the United States of America. That is Article 2, Section 1. Not some, or most, or even all, but a teeny-weeny bit of the executive power. The President is invested with all of it. This is particularly noteworthy when compared with the enumerated legislative powers in Congress, wherein the Constitution states, all powers herein granted. This is an interesting perspective by Michael Mukasey. He was the Attorney General of the United States from 2007 to 2009. And it just shows you what kind of power the president has. Of course, the Congress is there to check him. All right, so we're gonna do one more video relative to the president with respect to some of the modern issues that face us, which is one of the reasons the president's power has grown.